Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads for you guys. This time covering a series, a trilogy of fantasy novels um, by Brian Ruckley, who I have not read anything else of his, I don't think. I think he has a number of credits for writing. Comics and graphic novels and stuff. Um, so I don't really know too much about any of that. Basically, I mean, I'm not a huge comics guy, to be honest. I like a lot of kind of adaptations from comics. I like superhero stuff, but I'm not a huge comics guy. So anyway, um, but I just noticed when I was going through on Goodreads that he has some credits in there, which I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. This is not a, uh, a graphic novel series or anything like that. This is full on fantasy mass market paperbacks. I found these books in my local half price books when I was either in middle school or early high school. Looking at the publication dates, I don't remember if I bought all three of them at once together because I was like, oh, it's the whole series, um, or if I got them like one at a time in there. Um, but the third one wasn't. I pretty sure I had graduated middle school, or I say graduated. I'm pretty sure I was done with middle school by the time that the third one came out. So I'm not totally sure exactly when. I remember in my head it's around then when I read them, and I know I read the first one around then. I don't know if I read the second or third. I feel like I didn't read the second or third ones because I think I would remember more elements because all of the elements that I remembered from the series happened in the first book basically. Um, Although I, of course, did not nearly remember um, kind of accurately all of the things that happened in the first book. There was a lot of things that were slightly different than I remember, or a couple of events that I thought happened earlier in the book that are, especially the kind of finale of the first book, apparently stuck with me, but not in the way that it like specifically happens, which was kind of interesting. Um, and these, I think, are really, I guess I would say, an interesting series for, in some ways, what they represent beyond kind of specifically what the books are like, which is to say that, to my knowledge, they do not have like a particular um, like a solid fan base or anything. The first book has the most ratings on Goodreads at about 3,500, a little less than that, and then the second and third one are both less than 1,500. Which obviously, depending, there's some interesting stuff with like the way that um, Goodreads sort of ratings drop off depending on when things were published. So books that were published in like the mid 2000s, I don't know how representative that is of how much they were being read originally, kind of when they came out. But it's sort of an odd. The ratings also are not that great. They're in the like mid, a little under 3.5 stars for most of them. It looks like the second one is a little over that, but not super great. Not a ton of people reading these, um, and I think there's an interesting. I mean, obviously, because new things continue to be published and because only like a portion of things that get published can be like the upper echelon of things that get published, there's sort of a continual churn through of basically books like these books that kind of come out and don't make very much of a splash, and who knows if they even um, like made back the advance in royalties. That's one of the things with book publishing. If you guys don't know, for authors, right, generally when you sell a book to a publisher, you get an advance, and then royalties based on sales of the book count towards the advance until they pay off that total amount. You, as far as I know, pretty much never have to pay back anything from the advance if your book doesn't sell enough. Um, but a lot of books, some, huge percentage, like 80 or 90% of books published don't actually essentially make back their advance, right? It's a real mark of success if a book is able to sell enough copies that the royalties on those sales will be enough value to make more money after the advance, right? Um, which is sort of where I suspect that these fall in. They also, I don't know if you can see on the video based on the size, but there's a pull quote on the um, front of each of them, but the pull quote on the second and third books is from a review of the first book, which is always kind of a grim sign for a book series, because it's very hard to find a review that doesn't have at least like one sentence that is nice enough to the thing for a pull quote. I mean, you can see this often with like movie trailers where it's one sentence that clearly was from a review that wasn't super positive, but the one sentence was nice, and so it gets used as part of a promotional material. Um, and so I kind of wonder if the second and third books in this series were um, even like got very much attention from other other sources, right? Newspapers or online articles or whatever other kind of review sources would have kind of generated that material. So it's a really interesting kind of thing because in some ways I think these are books that really are kind of demonstrative of my sense of like what a lot of fantasy that was not super the fantasy that has not survived, for lack of a better term, fantasy stories that have not found a like particular audience that really cares about those stories and has kind of caused reprinting and all of that sort of stuff in this period of like basically what all of the things that I was looking at have price books at the time that weren't apparently selling that well, but that kind of existed and were sort of interesting to me when I was 12. So I guess that's kind of where I come from with regard to these books, is having been interested enough in this series when I was young to buy all three books for whatever it was, $8 a copy, for the whole set. Maybe less than that, to be honest. Who knows? Um, and then coming back to them as an adult many years later now, um, and being kind of interested in what I have found, because I think there is a sense of the sort of value of things that survive and the value of things that don't. That other fantasy series that were being published around the same time, some of them have done a much better job of staying in the public consciousness, in the awareness of fantasy readers and writers. And the fact that this one hasn't really, and I guess it's not. I don't think that these books are capital G great. There probably are. This is very much the sort of series that there probably are a handful of people who are like, oh, this is my favorite fantasy series. And you kind of have to go, but why? Um, because I think there are some really like quite good things in this series, but also as a whole, I don't think these are um, that much. I don't think these are that good, but I also don't really think that they're that much worse than a lot of the other things that have survived, which is kind of an interesting place. And there's sort of like a kind of a forensic project, I think, in there of looking at, well, why didn't these books like find an audience that would still be really interested in these, compared to some of the other things that have survived. And so that's part of what I want to talk about with these, is a little bit of why I think that that's the case. Um, and also just sort of broadly why I think you should check this series out if you have a chance. Because, like I said, I don't think these books are bad by any means. I think they just sort of fit into um, an odd period and an odd kind of very specific time frame and very specific flavor of fantasy storytelling, as far as I can tell. Which is to say, to talk specifically about the series, um, this is a series that is very kind of grim and gritty in a lot of ways. There's a lot of the idea of, the cost of war and of violence. One of like the core thematic elements of the story is about um, the difficulty of recovering from violence, both kind of being the actor and the victim, essentially, and the way that that leaves behind kind of physical scars in the case of a lot of the characters, but also the kind of mental scarring of trauma, basically, and the struggle of these characters to figure out how to um, continue to live in a world that is scarred by violence. And it gets into kind of an odd, I guess that speaks to, I suspect, part of why this series, I suspect, didn't survive as well, is because I think a lot of the first book is basically set up for the later books. Winterbirth, the first book in the series, is, I think, pretty unquestionably the weakest of the three, despite the fact that I think it's still all right. It is the world of this series is called the Godless World, and it is a fantasy world in which there apparently were gods, and there's three ages. The first age where the gods lived with the first race, and then the second age where the gods were a part of the world, and there were five sentient or sapient races, one of whom has been hunted to extinction, and that was the trigger that caused the gods to leave the mortal realms and not interact with mundanity anymore, and sort of caused the beginning of the third age, which is the age of the world in decline, in a sense. Um, the This is sort of the broad, kind of highest level thing about the world. Um, Within what is sort of modernity for the series, you in practice basically have two of these sapient races or sapiens. I guess they're sort of species. There's a whole thing with, for lack of a better term, hybridization. But there's humans who are called Huanin and Kiranin, who are sort of like elves in some ways. Um, but they are, I think, the comparison that comes to mind is a little bit like the Dalish elves in Dragon Age, or at least in Origins. I mean, I played the second one, but I haven't played any of the others. But that the Kiranin are very kind of graceful and agile, and they are hunters in the wilderness, but they also definitively live like a semi nomadic existence. They split into smaller groups over the summer and spread out over their territories, and then during the winter gather up together. Um, and there's a sense of kind of an almost First Nations vibe to them, I guess you might say. Um, but they have all of these different kind of cultural elements that are on display as a result of that. And then they also, for a lot of the human characters, they are kind of odd and weird. They have kind of strange tattoos that they use to mark themselves for success in battle. Um, and they are often at least somewhat antagonistic with the Huanin, although at times there are children who come from one Huanin parent and one Kiranin parent, and they are called Nakirim, and they are apparently all sterile, but as a result of their kind of particular hybridization, they have some traits from both parents, basically, and also are able to tap into what's called the shared, which is basically the source of magic. Except, I say it's magic. It is magical. It is a different sort of magic than a lot of much more kind of epic and in some ways even classical fantasy. Um, the shared has very much a kind of like a mental landscape quality, if that makes sense, in that a lot of the things that a person, a Nakarim in particular, can do with the shared has to do with um, influencing or reading the people around them. So there's one character who is really good at just sensing, like if people are lying to him and things like that. Or there's another character who is able to be very stealthy because he's essentially able to use the share to convince people not to notice him. And then the kind of biggest use of the shared has to do with sort of transforming the mental state of like huge groups or of essentially totally putting another person under mental subjection, right? Taking over a person. That in the lore, there's a story. Orlane, the King Binder, I think is his title, and he was a Nakarim who took over a king and was essentially the power behind the throne for many years, way long ago in the history of this world. But that's still sort of the demonstration of the fear of these hybrids, basically. Um, More recently than that is the other kind of, I guess you might say, inciting element, which is a religious division. That in this world there is a woman, the fisher woman, who has this religious experience and believes that the gods who have abandoned the world are waiting to return, and that there is a god, the last god, the hooded god, who is the personification of death, basically, and who has a book in which is written the fates of everything and everyone in existence. Um, and the end of this book is called The Call, and this is the event where the entirety of the world is subject to the Black Road, this religion. Everyone believes in this thing, and this causes the gods to come back and remake the world into a paradise, basically. Um, and I think one of the really interesting things about this series is that there's not really a competitor to the Black Road, because this is the godless world, as the series says. There aren't really other religions. There are other kind of ritualized practices, but there's not like a theological competitor to this belief. um, and a lot of the story has to do with the forces of the Black Road, who about 130 140 years before the events of the main series were kicked out of the main kingdom. Basically, they started a civil war and there was a lot of fighting, and they end up um, going over the mountains and setting up their own, not kingdom, but a thainship. They don't call themselves kings because the old kings were kind of bad. But both sides, the True Bloods and the Black Road Bloods, have thainships with a number of thanes who are the kind of leaders of their blood, just a community. And the blood thing has to do with swearing fealty on blood. And then there's a Thane of Thanes in both cases, who is sort of the head of what is basically the equivalent of a kingdom. Anyway, all of that leads into the eventual kind of main story, which is about Arisian is one of our main characters. His older sister is another character. His kind of mentor at home is another main character. One of the Black Road leaders, Kanan, is a character. There is Aeglis the Nakirim, who is a major antagonist. There's all of these kind of couple of different characters, not that many. But the Black Roads are on the attack and end up taking a lot of territory and killing a lot of people, and the kind of broad story is about the war between the True Bloods and the Black Road Bloods. And what I was leading into way back at the beginning of this digression is that I think there is a really interesting thing going on where there is specifically not like a theological opposition to the Black Roads. There is kind of a distaste for their ideas in a lot of cases among the True Bloods, but there's not really like a definitive, you guys are heretics or anything like that, um, which I think leads into thematically one of the big things that this series is also about, aside from kind of the effects of violence, is the sort of senselessness of conflict. The idea of conflict as a continual result of retributive strikes that goes way back to the beginning, but has sort of spun all out of control, because that's very much what the struggle between the Black Road and the True Bloods is like. Is that by now they just sort of hate each other because they fought each other for a long time. There's not like a definitive, you know, an intellectual argument to be had about why you should hate the Black Road Bloods, aside from like, well, they killed killed your grandfather, so you have to hate them, that sort of thing, right? And the same on the other side is that, like, part of the reason that they have a specific religious prophecy that leads them to suggest that the need to conquer all these different places, but fundamentally the reason that they hate is more about history than it is about theology. Anyway, so all of that leads into our adventure, which involves Arisian is definitely kind of our main character. He is the nephew of the Lannis Thane, and he has, at the beginning of the story, lost his mother and his elder brother to the plague. His dad has is suffering from really severe depression. His older sister almost died to the plague, but is still around. And so a lot of his kind of struggles have to do with his own sense of worthiness, the sense that his brother was like the rightful heir, and that his brother is gone, his older brother is gone, and so now how can he kind of live up to what he thought his older brother was going to be like, all of that. um, and then there are attacks and calamities and all these different things, and I don't want to get too far into specifically what happens, but I think I want to talk about a couple of other things about basically why to read this series, um, and also kind of why I think this hasn't didn't kind of catch on in some ways. One of the big things being that the world does not feel small, but we don't see that much of this world actively. Um, the adventures that these characters go on are often through kind of quite hostile territory, and they take a long time, but we don't see, like all of these different kingdoms or different places or different cultures, really. In particular, we see a lot of the same places, and I think that's part of the strength, because that also really ties into this idea of the effects of violence, because a lot of times we will see a place at one point in the story and then see it again later after an army has moved through, or it has been under siege or something like that. And that's really like a lot of what this story is about, like I said. But it also, I think, leads to the sense of, if you're a big Malazan fan and you really like seeing all of the different places at play within the world of Malazan, I can see how reading this you would be like, well, wait a second, we only see like, six different towns in the course of the book, maybe more than that, but not that many places. There's a lot more emphasis on kind of retreading the the ground, basically, and coming to different places and then saying, okay, well, what has happened in this place in the intervening time. Of course, there's also some really cool stuff with that. One of the sequences in the first book involves an army that is destroyed by destroying a dam. The dam was built to create an artificial lake to basically cover up an old city. And so after the dam is destroyed, that city is no longer covered up by the lake, and so it becomes inhabited again. And there's some really fun and interesting sort of um, gritty fantasy stuff about that I really liked. Um, and that, like I said, ties into this thematic stuff about the effects of history and violence over the course of generations. But it also, like I said, kind of takes away from, especially the sort of magical side of fantasy. This is really pretty low fantasy. There's a little bit of magic, like I said, among the Nakirim, and the magic becomes kind of a big deal later. But especially in the first book, this is mostly, could be like a I don't know if there's a term. There's kind of historical fantasy of like fantasy in a historical setting, um, but this is more like magicless fantasy, right? Like a fantasy world that is being treated as history, um, and that changes over the course of the series. And I think that change is actually for the better. The really interesting stuff that happens in the second book, and especially the third book, has to do with how that kind of changes and how um, some of the magical elements start to become more and more important to the story and start to have larger and larger impacts in this world, which is really cool. That's, I think, where in some ways the series really shines, is to see this kind of long-term change in this environment that we get to know really well over the course of these books. Um, but like I said, that also kind of takes away from the sort of globe-trotting aspect of some fantasy. And I wonder if that has to do with part of why this one didn't take off as much. And also, it is a tough sell to have your first book be the weakest in a series. And I kind of wonder if that has to do with it also. That if Winterbirth is all right, but it doesn't really have the same highs as Bloodheir, or especially Bloodheir, or especially Fall of Thanes. And I suspect that's also part of why things didn't quite take off as much for this one. Um, yeah, and I guess I will, since we're talking about magic, kind of one of the last things I'll get into is that I think this presents a really interesting version of magic that allows for some kind of structure and systematization. The way that it seems like there's a lot of interest in, magic systems in fantasy, especially kind of that sort of has become a really big thing, obviously. And Brandon Sanderson's books as a kind of big demonstration of, and a real banner carrier for that particular concept. Um, and this one, I think, does a really interesting thing where there are kind of rules and logic to the magic, while it also remains mysterious and interesting in really cool ways. And I think that's a real strength, like I said, especially later on in the series, as the magical elements become more important, and as you can kind of get a grip on what's going on. Some of the sort of other power players in the world don't even really come into play until the second and third book. There's a species called the Inane, who are a little bit like ethereal ints, if that makes sense. They're sort of like forest spirits that have this much deeper connection to the shared than anyone else. And they are kind of immensely powerful, and in the way of very, very ancient powerful beings, often unconcerned with who they end up hurting as a result of their involvement. And that becomes a sort of running theme within the story also, is the way that the people caught in between these very powerful forces end up suffering because of just their circumstances. So anyway, it's cool, it's fun, and these books are not super short, but they're also not particularly difficult. Probably the weakest element is that they, I think, do not really have very many um, like shocking moments in prose. Not in the sense of like not having exciting things that happen in the events, but really on the level of like a beautiful sentence that is really easy to say, like, well, this is why I like this series, is because this like really beautiful and clear statement of truth is there. Um, that I think a number of kind of competitor series end up catching on some level with that. I think about Malazan in particular, that Malazan, for being really large books and I think are mostly like fairly well written, but not, I mean, it's not like reading. I've talked about reading Virginia Woolf before. Is reading Virginia Woolf is sort of an exercise in reading through tears, because you'll never write anything as beautiful as what she writes. Um, and for the most part, they're, you know, how much fantasy is actually like that. But there are some moments in a lot of these other series that I think kind of capture that particular, like, well, this is one sentence that really stands for this. And I don't think you really get that, like, really kind of shockingly excellent moment until basically like the third book. I think that also speaks to why I think the third book is the best of the three in some ways. That I think it gets into that more, that the kind of flavor of this story has really kind of come into its own by the end. But that also sort of speaks to why people wouldn't read the series as a whole. That even if you read the first book, you might be like, you know, it's all right, but it's not like, you know, particularly memorable in some ways. So, anyway, I guess what I would say is that I think these books are pretty good. They're each in the around 600 pages mark, but they're pretty quick reads. I mean, each of them took me like 3 or 4 days, honestly, um, because they're pretty quick reads. So, you know, worth worth checking out if you are interested in a like very specific vision of what like one version of mid-list fantasy was like between 2006 and 2009. This is, I think, an interesting perspective on that. And it's, I think, a story that gets better as it gets told, which is always nice. I think there's a sort of tension between starting off really strong and growing to be really strong. And obviously, you would really like both of those, but often it's difficult to balance those. And compared to some other series that I've read that I think gradually lose some steam, this one really builds up steam really well, to use the sort of inversion of that metaphor. So, anyway, on the whole, like I said, I think there are some reasons this hasn't survived as well. I also think it is kind of odd that it has. I guess what I would say is, after all of those things, all of the things I've described, I don't know if kind of sum up totally why this hasn't had like more awareness or familiarity within fantasy as a whole. And I don't know if there is like a definitive reason why. And I guess that's kind of a good summation for a story that has a lot thematically to do with the ideas about kind of arbitrary violence, and the way that the world is difficult to make sense of in chaotic times, that it would sort of be appropriate for it to be kind of hard to make sense of exactly the legacy of this series or lack thereof, um, for kind of who knows what the precise causes of that are. So anyway, like I said, pretty good books, worth checking out if you're interested in this kind of particular flavor of fantasy, this very kind of gritty and grounded, or mostly very gritty and grounded fantasy story about, yeah, all of these different competing warrior ideas, and the struggles between different peoples. So anyway, that is going to be that for me. Um, yeah, I hope you have enjoyed. Check out these books. You might be able to find cheap copies. I don't know how many copies there are out in the world. I don't even know if there are digital copies of this for sale or not. Who knows? But yeah, the Godless World trilogy, Winterbirth, Bloodheir, Fall of Thanes by Brian Ruckley. Check it out if this sounds interesting to you. Otherwise, I have been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.